Masechet Baba Batra, Daf Lamed Zayin, Amar Rabbi Ishmael Bamed Rim Amurim B'steh Halavan. In the Mishnah, Rabbi Ishmael was the opinion that one can make a chazakah in 18 months, and that is regarding a Sedeh Lavan, a wheat field. That depends on rain. You could have 3 and then months, and then a whole year, and then another 3 months. And then Rabbi Akiva said you could do it in 14 months, and then Rabbi Ishmael one-upped Rabbi Akiva and said, actually, I think that you can make a chazakah in even a shorter time, as long as you have 3 harvests, even of different crops. Rabbi Ishmael says that's sufficient. If you harvest, let's say, grapes and olives and figs from the same field, you have all these trees are scattered on the same field, and you have 3 harvests, even within 1 year. Those are considered 3 different usages of the field. You're consuming the field 3 different times for 3 different things, and that can make a chazakah, which would be a much shorter time. That was the opinion of Rabbi Ishmael. Amar Abaye. Rabbi Ishmael nishma l'Rabbanan. Abaye says something very interesting. From the law of Rabbi Ishmael, we can learn a principle, and we can apply that principle to the opinion of Rabbanan who disagree with Rabbi Ishmael. In other words, even though they disagree on a fundamental point of can you use 3 different crops, Rabbi Ishmael says yes, you can. Rabbanan says no, it has to be all the same crop. So even though they disagree, nevertheless we can learn something from Rabbi Ishmael that we can apply to the opinion of Rabbanan as follows. Hayu lo sheloshim ilanot mimata asara lebet se'ah. Achal asara b'shana zo, v'asara b'shana zo, v'asara b'shana zo, hareh zo chazakah. If a person had 30 trees, fruit trees, and they were planted with a certain density of 10 trees per bet se'ah. In other words, if you have 30 trees, it would be 3 bet se'ah, and these 30 trees are scattered all over. It has to be that ratio, because if it's more than that, then that's called a forest. And in the end, you're going to have to uproot some of those trees because they're not going to grow well. And so that is not called an orchard. If it's less than that, also, it's not called an orchard. It's called a field with just a couple of trees on it. The point is that one wants to acquire all of the land, this entire property, by consuming the fruit of the tree. So if you have this ratio and a person goes and consumes the fruit of those trees 3 times, then that will be a chazakah, and they own not just the tree. See, if just 1 tree, okay, maybe that's a chazakah just for the tree. But if you want to establish your ownership over the whole land, then it has to be an orchard, and for it to be an orchard, it has to be this proper ratio. That's how people plant orchards. That's not too much and not too little. Okay, so let's assume that one has this 3 bet se'ah piece of land with 30 trees on it. And someone comes and he's squatting on this land, and he harvests from 10 trees in year 1, a different 10 trees in year 2, and a different 10 trees in year 3. That is considered a chazakah. How can we learn this, that Rabbanan would agree with this from the words of Rabbi Ishmael? We explain further. Lav mi amar Rabbi Ishmael, chad pera have chazakah lechulu pere, hachaname hane havu chazakah lehane, v'hane havu chazakah lehane. Did Rabbi Ishmael say that one type of fruit can make a chazakah for all of the fruit trees in that area? That in year 1 you're harvesting grapes. Okay, but the grapes are on the same field as the other trees, and so even though you only got grapes this year, that's called a chazakah for everything. And the second year you get olives, and that's considered a chazakah even for the grapevines and for the figs that you're going to do in the 3rd year. So just like Rabbi Ishmael, who said it's true that you can use 3 different crops, but yet the main point that we're deriving from Rabbi Ishmael is that you can have some trees, as long as you're harvesting from some trees, they can cover for all of the field, even though you're not taking from every tree. So too here, let's apply that to Rabbanan. They say you can't use 3 different crops, no good. Has to be all the same type of fruit. Fine, we have 30 apple trees, and we take from 10 trees now, and a second 10 trees at another time, and the other 10 trees at a different time, then that can make a chazakah. And even though you only took from 10 trees the first time, that can cover the entire orchard. That is Abaye's derivation. Now we qualify it. But this is true only if the other 20 did not yet produce fruit. In other words, in year 1, you have 10 trees that have nice apples that are ready, and the other ones are not ready yet. Okay, and you only take those 10. That makes sense. And then the next time, the same thing. These 10 are ready and the other ones are not. Then it can be a chazakah. But if they're all produce fruit and they're all ready, then that's not a chazakah. You just took from 10 and ignored the rest. That's not a normal way to harvest a field. And in order to make a chazakah, it has to be in a normal way that you harvest a field. And so if they're all ready, then just take them all at once. But if they become ready at 3 different times and you harvest them at those 3 different times, then that is a chazakah. And furthermore, another qualification, vehu debazeh bazuzeh, and that's only if the trees are scattered. If you have all 10 trees of year 1 on the left side, and then all trees of year 2 in the middle, and all trees of year 3 on the right side, then those are like 3 separate fields. You only get there is no chazakah because you didn't take from the same field for 3 years in a row. But if they're all scattered and mixed up within each other, and you take 10 scattered ones from year 1, and then year 2, and then year 3, and so on, then you can acquire the entire field. The point is, you don't have to consume every single tree every single year, but just like Rabbi Ishmael said, you can consume from some of the trees at this point, and then some at the second and third. So too, Rabbanan would agree when they are all the same fruit. Next, Zeh chazik beilanot v'zeh chazik bakarka. Amar Rav Zevid, Zeh kana ilanot v'zeh kana karka. So here, chazakah can mean 2 things. Remember, chazakah can mean proving a presumption of ownership by being there for 3 years or 3 consumptions. Chazakah can also mean acquiring. There's a big machloket among the Rishonim which one it means here. A simple reading, I think, is that it's talking about acquiring it in the first place. So doing chazakah means using the field one time, and as an owner would, consuming it, plowing it, tilling the land, doing an action one time, and thereby acquiring it from someone who is giving it to you as a gift, or as a sale, or taking something that's hefker, that's ownerless, and making it your own by doing an act of a chazakah. Okay, so we have a field that, let's say it's hefker, or someone's giving it as a gift. Hefker is easier to understand. You have this ownerless land, and then these 2 people come along, and one of them does a chazakah action on the fruit. He starts plucking the fruit, or doing something to the tree to make that his. And the other one does a chazakah action on the land. He starts tilling the land. And so Rav Zevid says, the one that does an action of a chazakah on the trees, he will acquire the trees, and the other one who does so with the land will acquire the land. Same thing if it was a gift that someone was giving. He can say, here, I'm giving you a gift. I'm giving you the trees and giving you the land, but the acquisition does not take effect until they go and they do something on the land, and that they can split it that way. One person can own the trees and one person can own the land. מתקיף לה רב פאפא, אם כן, אין לו לבעל אילנות בקרקע כלום, למלא בעל קרקע לבעל אילנות, הכל אילנך שכל וזיל. Rav Papa has a problem with Rav Zevid's law, because if you say that, then the owner of the tree doesn't own any of the land, and then the owner of the land will be able to say to the owner of the tree, take your trees and get them off my land. What are you doing? You're trespassing, right? Your trees are on my land, and they're gaining nourishment from my land, and now I can't use all my land as I want to. So you own the trees. I agree, you own the trees. Good, go take them away. But that wouldn't make sense. You're going to uproot all these trees. They're not going to survive probably. Rather, it must mean that when a person acquires the tree, that the gift giver or whatever, if it's ownerless, the idea is that the intention is that the person who owns the tree also owns some of the land. So the Papa's language here is the one who owns the tree owns half the land and the other one owns half the land. Rambam takes that literally, actually half the land, 50% of the land. But it can also mean that the one that owns the tree owns some of the land. How much? The land under the tree, the amount of land that is required to sustain the tree. He owns that much land, but not the rest of it. Which, well, depending on how many trees there are, might be less than half of the land. But the point is, they share the ownership of the land in some proportion, and therefore the owner of the land cannot say to the owner of the trees, take your trees and get out. The owner of the tree has some ownership over the land. Now, so far we discussed a case of someone that owns trees on a land and he gives away or sells the trees to one person and the land to someone else. And here the discussion was, the person that gets the trees, do they get only the trees, that's Rav Zavid, or do they also get some land together with the trees, that's Rav Papa. Now we're going to apply those principles and these two opinions to a slightly different case of someone who owns trees and land, and he's selling to one other person either only the trees and keeping the land for himself, or only the land and keeping the trees for himself. So in these cases, does whoever get the trees also get some of the land or not? Let's go through the different permutations. Peshita, machar karka v'shiyed ilanot lefanav yesh lo karka. So it's a simple matter that if someone sells land and he keeps the trees on the land, I'm keeping the right to the trees and whatever tree the trees produce, but I'm only giving you the land. So it's simple in that case that the original owner, the seller, keeps part of the land that's surrounding the trees. That's for sure the case. Even though he's selling the land, he wants to keep the trees, and obviously he wants to keep some of the land around the trees, and this would be true according to everybody. And even according to Rabbi Akiva, who in general says that when someone sells, he sells generously, right? Even though he's selling it, he's giving away something that is his own, he's getting paid for it. And when someone gives something away, he wants to give it away or sell it in a generous way. Nevertheless, Rabbi Akiva himself only applies this principle to a specific case. That's only when someone is selling land and keeping for himself a cistern or a pit. In that case, he's keeping only the cistern, but no land, not even any land around the cistern, not even a path to get to the cistern or the pit, which you'll have to get to somehow, or have to pay for a path to get to it. So if I own land with a cistern on it, and I sell to you the land, I'm selling you all of the land, because in that case, the land is not the cistern is not causing any harm to the land. And so therefore, I don't need to keep any land for myself. I give you all the land, I keep the cistern, I own the water. I'll have to figure out a way to get to it. And that's the case where Rabbi Akiva says someone who sells the land sells it generously, all of the land, and doesn't keep any land for himself. Aval ilanot dekam machshi be'ar'a shiure shier tila shier lemale akod ilana veziel. However, when it comes to trees take nourishment from the land and weaken the land around the trees. In that case, surely the seller who's selling the land is going to keep some land for himself, the area around the trees. Because if not, then the buyer who owns the land will be able to tell the seller, listen, this is all my land. I own every speck of dust over here, and therefore take your trees and uproot them and take them somewhere else because they are weakening my land. And the original owner, the seller, obviously wants to keep his trees there, so therefore he's going to keep some of the land. And even Rabbi Akiva would agree with that. Even though you're being generous, you don't want to sabotage yourself. You want to keep your trees and keep the land around them. Okay, everybody agrees regarding that. Now the other way around. Machad ilanot v'shiyer karka lefanav pelukta de Rabbi Akiva v'Rabbanan. Le Rabbi Akiva damar mocher b'ayin yafa mocher itle, le Rabbanan letle. If someone sells trees and keeps the land for himself, I'll give you the trees, but I'm keeping the land. In that case, does the buyer who buys the trees, does he own some of the land or not? Well, that depends. It's a machloket between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbanan. According to Rabbi Akiva, when someone sells something, he sells generously. So, I'm the seller, I'm generous, I'm selling you the trees, and I'm going to be so generous that I'm going to assume that you get some of the land also, and therefore, according to Rabbi Akiva, the buyer of the trees gets some of the land. However, the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Akiva, and they say that someone who sells be'ayin ra'ah, in a stingy way. I sold you only the trees, and that's it, and therefore you get no land together with it. Okay, now we're going to emphasize how strongly Rabbi Akiva has his opinion and Rabbanan has his opinion. Rabbi Akiva itle, va'afilu l'Rav Zevid, amar en lo, הנמי לגבי שני לקוחות דאמר לה, כי הכי דלדידי לית לי באילנות, לדידך נמה לית לך בקרקע, אבל הכא מוכר בעין יפה מוכר. According to Rabbi Akiva, the buyer of the trees gets some of the land around it. And this is true even according to Rav Zevid, who said in the previous case of two buyers that are sharing in the acquisition, and one takes trees and gets trees only, and one takes land and gets all the land. Rav Zevid said in that case that the owner of the trees gets no land. That's true. But Rav Zevid only said that when there's two buyers or two receivers, because one can say to the other, just like I have no share in the trees, I only got land. So too, you have no share in the land. You only get the trees, right? It's not like they're sharing, you get half the trees and half the land, and you get half the trees and half the land. The owner of the land says, since I'm only getting land, not trees, it makes sense that you should get only trees and not land. And that was Rav Zevid's logic in that case. When there's two buyers, the owner of the tree gets no land. However, in this case, where there's just two people, the seller and the buyer, and the seller is giving the trees to the buyer, now the buyer has the trees, and the seller, we assume, sells generously. In that case, even Rav Zevid would agree that the buyer of the trees does receive some of the land. And the other way, the other opinion, l'Rabbanan let le, va'afilu l'Rav Papa damar yesh lo hanemi legabe shene lakochot, damar le ki hechi de ledidach zabin be'ayin yafa, ledidi name zabin be'ayin yafa, aval hacha mocher be'ayin ra'ah mocher. And the rabbis say that in the same case where I'm selling you the trees, the rabbis say that the buyer gets only the trees and no land. And this is true even according to Rav Papa, who said in the previous case that when there are two buyers or two receivers, that Rav Papa said the one who makes a chazakah on the trees also gets some of the land. That's true in that case because one can say to the other, just like to you, this guy sold it generously, to me also he sold it generously. So the owner of the trees is saying to the owner of the land, right? Sellers are generous, and we're both buying it from one seller, and he was generous to you and gave you this land, and he's generous to me and gave me the trees together with some of the land. So that's true. That according to Rav Papa, that would be true in a case where a seller is selling it to two people. You see, even Rabbanan would agree that a seller is generous if he's giving up everything, because he's not keeping anything for himself, and therefore it's not a matter of being stingy or generous. No matter what, he's not going to have anything. The question is only what proportion is he giving to the guy who gets the land and the guy who gets the trees. And so it's easy for him to be generous in giving the guy who gets the trees also some of the land. He's not losing out anything. The guy who got the land is losing out something. So the Rav Papa says that in that case. However, even Rav Papa would agree with Rabbanan in this case when the seller is keeping something for himself, that he's doing so in a stingy way. And therefore he's saying, I'm keeping the land, I'm keeping all the land, I'm selling you the trees, but only the trees, and you get no land at all. Amri Nehar De'ah, Achalan Resufin en lo chazaka. The sages of Nehar De'ah said that if you have a vineyard that's overcrowded and someone consumes the grapes from those vines, he does not get ownership of the entire orchard of the land, because since it's overcrowded, necessarily they're going to have to end up uprooting many of the vines, and therefore acquisition of the vines is not acquisition of the whole thing. It has to be in the right proportion, the normal proportion that one plants vines in a vineyard. Then it's called a vineyard, and then if If you use the vines, then you own the whole vineyard. But if it's overcrowded, then it's just temporarily there, and then the connection between the vines and the whole orchard is lost, not called an orchard, so he doesn't get the land. Matkif la Rava, ele me'ata hai meshara de aspasta, b'mai kani le. Now Rava challenges the sages of Nahar De'ah and says, according to you, how would anyone ever acquire an alfalfa field? Because that is planted without any space in between. So he's using up he's consuming all the alfalfa, and you'd say, well, that's overcrowded. So then, but you never, if I sell you an alfalfa field and you go and consume it, you'll say, oh, that's overcrowded. You don't get the field. Well, then how can anyone ever acquire such a field? Ela amar Rava mecharan resufin en lo karka. Rather, Rava has a different version of this statement. He would say that if you make a chazakah on even an overcrowded field, you would get the whole field, because that's how it works for alfalfa, and that would work according for a vineyard also according to Rava. Rather, Rava's version of this halacha is that if someone sells a few trees and they're overcrowded, overcrowded vineyard, then he does not sell also the land. It works as follows. If it's the proper proportion, and I'm selling you these vines, and it's the right proportion of vines per land, then we assume that not only you get the vines, you also get the field. That's assumed. But if it's overcrowded, then it's not called an orchard, and therefore I'm selling you only the vines, you only acquire the vines, and you do not get the land underneath, because we're assuming that many of these vines will be uprooted. So I'm selling you the vines, some will stay, some will go, but the land, we don't assume that all the land under it is going to be yours, because these are only temporary. So Rava says it's not talking about the chazakah, but rather the sale. The sale will not assume the land. If it's overcrowded, it'll be only for the trees. If it's the right proportion, then since all these vines are staying, and now it's called an orchard, so in that case, selling the vines, it would be selling the whole orchard. Amar Rabbi Zera ketanae kerem shehu natua al pachot me'arba amot. Rabbi Shimon omer eno kerem. Chachamim omerim hare zo kerem vero'in et ha'im sayim ki'ilu enan. Rabbi Zera says this matter is a dispute among Tanaim, as we see in a baraita. If you have a vineyard that is planted with less than 4 amot between each vine, you're supposed to have at least 4 amot between each vine. If it's less than that, then that's overcrowded. And in such a case, Rabbi Shimon says that's not called a vineyard, and therefore the buyer of the vines will not acquire the land. You're not getting the whole vineyard as one, you'll just get these vines, but not the land. But Chachamim omerim harezo kerem vero'in et sayim ki'ilu enan. However, Chachamim say that this is called a vineyard, and we consider the middle vines, that are the ones that are making the overcrowding, where we ignore them. We consider it as if they're not there, since they're temporary, because they're going to be plucked out. So we consider it as if they're not there, and we look at it now in the proper proportion, and since it's the right proportion, it is called an orchard. And once I'm selling you the vines that are an orchard, that means we're assuming that you're buying the entire orchard. And so according to Chachamim, someone who sells an overcrowded vineyard does get the whole thing. According to Bishimon, they do not. So we see that this is subject to a machloket Tanaim. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen ve'amen.